At a heated international forum, U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar openly mocked Burkina Faso's young president, Ibrahim Traoré, laughing at him for 5 long minutes in front of world leaders. Many thought he would lose his composure, but instead, Traoré stunned the entire room with a calm, powerful response that flipped the atmosphere instantly. His words struck so deeply that Omar's laughter faded, leaving her career in question and the audience in shock. This unforgettable clash is spreading like wildfire across the globe, with millions calling it one of the most defining moments of dignity, courage, and leadership in modern politics. The air in the Grand Conference Hall was thick with tension. Delegates from every corner of the world had gathered for a week-long international forum meant to discuss global security and cooperation. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and leaders shifted in their seats as the program began. Among the most anticipated speakers was Burkina Faso's young president, Ibrahim Traoré. Many were curious about him. His reputation for courage had spread across Africa and beyond. As he rose to speak, the room quieted. His calm presence carried a rare authority. But then, suddenly, a sharp laugh broke the silence. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar leaned back in her chair, openly mocking him. At first, people thought it was a brief outburst. Yet, her laughter stretched on seconds into minutes. The hall grew restless. Some leaders turned away in discomfort. Others watched unsure. For 5 long minutes, the mocking continued, echoing through the hall like a cruel performance. The world's cameras captured every moment. Eyes shifted back to Traoré. Many expected anger, maybe even an outburst. Yet he remained completely still, his hands folded on the podium, his gaze steady. His silence began to feel heavier than Omar's laughter. Something was about to happen. As the 5th minute dragged on, the mood in the hall turned sour. Diplomats shifted uneasily in their seats. What was meant to be a day of cooperation was unraveling into humiliation. The laughter, though loud, now seemed forced. Some leaders exchanged glances of disbelief. Had anyone ever dared mock a head of state so openly? But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. His breathing was calm, his face steady, his eyes locked gently on Omar without anger, almost as if he was waiting. The longer he stood in silence, the weaker her laughter became. One by one, the chuckles in the hall died. The only sound left was the clicking of camera shutters and the faint hum of the microphones. Omar, realizing she stood alone, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Finally, Traoré adjusted the microphone. His voice, when it came, was soft. So soft that people leaned in to hear. Laughter, he began, is a gift when it heals wounds. But when it tries to belittle dignity, it reveals more about the one laughing than the one being laughed at. The words cut through the silence like a blade. The hall froze. Omar's face tightened. The atmosphere had shifted. The room leaned forward, hungry for his next words. Traoré's voice was steady, but it carried a weight that no one expected from someone so young. I was raised, he continued, in a land where children walk miles for water, where mothers sing songs of hope at night so their families can sleep despite hunger. If we laughed at each other's pain, there would be no strength left to carry on. A hush swept across the audience. Leaders who moments ago were restless now sat frozen. The images he painted were not abstract politics. They were raw reality. Even the translators paused for a heartbeat, struck by the emotion in his tone. Traoré then looked directly at Omar, not with hatred, but with an expression almost like compassion. "So if my presence makes you laugh," he said gently, "then let it be known. I came here not for applause nor for scorn. I came to remind the world that dignity cannot be mocked. It is carried inside, stronger than ridicule, stronger than fear." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones buzzed. Tweets flew. Cameras zoomed closer. The young president had flipped the atmosphere in minutes. Omar's laughter was gone. The silence in the hall grew heavier with each passing second after Traoré's words. Delegates whispered in low tones, their faces betraying shock and respect. Some leaned over to one another, murmuring that they had just witnessed history. Others quietly wiped at their eyes, touched by the dignity he displayed. But while many were moved, a few officials looked unsettled. Cameras from across the globe zoomed in on Omar, who now sat stiff, her earlier laughter replaced with a frozen smile that did little to hide her discomfort. Traoré, however, did not gloat. He simply stood tall, adjusting his notes without rushing, as though the interruption had not broken his spirit, but made his voice even stronger. Around the room, journalists scrambled to capture every detail. Tweets, live streams, and instant posts began flooding the internet. Within minutes, hashtags with his name trended worldwide. Behind the curtains, aides to powerful leaders exchanged anxious looks. What had started as ridicule was transforming into a storm that no one could control. The question hung in the air. Would Traoré continue, or had his quiet defense already said more than enough? The microphone crackled again as Traoré lifted his gaze to the audience. His eyes moved slowly across the hall, as if to remind every person present that his words were not for one nation, but for all. Dignity, he said, voice stronger now, is not the language of the powerful. It is the cry of the forgotten, the shield of the poor, and the soul of a people who refuse to bow. Every phrase struck like thunder. Delegates shifted in their chairs, gripped by something raw and undeniable. The young president was no longer speaking as a politician. He was speaking as a witness to survival. He told of villages that resisted despair, of children who studied under dim lamps powered by hope alone. He painted pictures so real that some leaders closed their eyes, imagining them. The hall, once a place of chatter, was now a cathedral of silence. Even those who had doubted him moments earlier felt a weight pressing on their hearts. Omar sat still, her eyes darting nervously, realizing she was no longer the center of attention. The room belonged to him, and the world watching live began to feel the shift. Outside the hall, the world exploded with reactions. News networks cut into their programming, replaying the clip of Omar's laughter against Traoré's calm rebuke. On social media, millions shared the moment, many writing that it was the first time in years they had seen such composure in politics. In Washington, aides to senior lawmakers rushed into offices with tablets, warning that the incident was already dominating global headlines. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered around radios and television sets, listening with pride as their president's voice echoed across continents. Inside the hall, reporters' phones buzzed endlessly. One journalist whispered to another, "This is bigger than any policy debate. This is history." But as the attention grew, so did the tension. Omar's allies shifted uncomfortably, worried about how the moment would be perceived back home. Meanwhile, other leaders now leaned forward, eager to hear what Traoré would say next. Would he stop at words of dignity, or would he push further, challenging the very foundation of the forum itself? The young president adjusted the microphone once more, his face calm, but his presence overwhelming. The world braced for his next words. The silence that followed Traoré's last words was unlike anything the forum had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of boredom or disinterest. It was the silence of people struck in their very souls. A delegate from Asia wiped his glasses slowly, as though buying time to hide his moist eyes. A European ambassador leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself, "This young man is changing everything." But for Omar, the silence felt like chains. Every second stretched longer, the weight pressing down on her shoulders. She tried to maintain her composure, but the glow of cameras magnified every twitch of discomfort. Meanwhile, Traoré stood firm, breathing steadily. His calmness seemed almost supernatural, the type of composure that only comes from a deep well of faith and conviction. The hall wasn't just waiting anymore. It was surrendering to his presence. He had no army, no wealth of nations behind him, yet in that moment, he held the room in the palm of his hand, and he had not even reached the heart of his message yet. Traoré leaned closer to the microphone. His voice dropped low, almost like a father speaking to children who had quarreled too long. My people taught me that when someone mocks you, you have two choices: to mirror their weakness or to reveal your strength. Burkina Faso has chosen strength. Our dignity is our weapon, and our patience is our shield. The words landed heavily. Delegates who had expected fiery anger instead heard wisdom clothed in humility. He continued, his tone soft but piercing. I am the son of farmers. My father once told me, if the world laughs at you, let them laugh, but never let them take away your respect for yourself. Today I stand here with that respect intact. Gasps were heard across the hall. For the first time, Omar lowered her gaze. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every sentence. In Burkina Faso, the words were replayed live on radios, leaving families in tears. Farmers in the fields stopped their work to listen, their hearts swelling with pride. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal, human, and unshakably real. By now, the entire hall was leaning toward Traoré. The same leaders who once underestimated him now looked as if they were listening to an elder statesman. His calmness had turned ridicule into reverence. Suddenly, applause broke out, not from one corner, but scattered across the room. It began with hesitant claps, then grew into waves of thunderous approval. Delegates rose from their chairs, some even with tears glistening in their eyes. Omar's face darkened. Her laughter, which only minutes ago echoed across the globe, was now being drowned out by the sound of dignity, reclaiming its place. Traoré did not smile. He simply bowed his head slightly as though humbled by the reaction. Then he raised his hand, signaling for quiet. This is not about me, he said. This is about a world that must learn to respect even the smallest voice. Because that small voice may one day rise and shake the mountains. Outside the hall, news anchors described the moment as an earthquake in global politics. Clips spread like wildfire, touching hearts across every continent. And inside, the tide had fully turned. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer being mocked. He was being celebrated. By the time the forum paused for a short recess, the internet had already erupted. Clips of Omar's laughter and Traoré's response were spreading like wildfire across TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. Millions of comments poured in. Some praised his restraint. This is leadership, calm in the face of insult. Others expressed shame for what they had witnessed. 5 minutes of cruelty destroyed in 5 sentences of truth. In Ouagadougou, people poured into the streets, waving flags, their pride overflowing. Markets closed early as families gathered around radios and televisions, repeating his words to each other with tears in their eyes. Meanwhile, in Washington, Omar's team scrambled to control the narrative. But every attempt at explanation was met with more backlash. The moment had grown too big. It was no longer just about her. It was about what Traoré represented. Back in the hall, journalists were already calling it the speech of the decade. But Traoré, seated quietly at his table, seemed untouched by the chaos outside. He sipped water slowly, his calmness like a river flowing steady despite the flood around him. The storm was no longer his to fight. It was carrying him higher. In a private lounge behind the hall, several senior diplomats gathered in hushed tones. The world just saw a shift. One whispered, another shook his head, saying, he turned ridicule into reverence. That's rare. A European leader confessed quietly. We underestimated him. This young man speaks with the weight of history. Meanwhile, Omar was escorted into a side room by her aides. The cameras outside caught only glimpses of her face, now pale and tense. Inside, her team debated damage control, but she could barely hear them. Her mind replayed Traoré's words, each one echoing louder than the last. In another corner of the lounge, a group of African leaders gathered around Traoré. They patted his back, offering quiet congratulations, but he only nodded humbly, saying, "It is not about me. It is about what we stand for." One of them whispered, "Do you realize what you've done? You've changed the balance of this forum." Traoré simply replied, "Then may it be for good." Even behind closed doors, the weight of his dignity was undeniable. Back in Burkina Faso, night had fallen, but no one slept. Entire neighborhoods gathered around projectors showing live news streams. In rural villages, battery-powered radios crackled with updates. Elders sat beside children telling them, "Remember this night. Our president is showing the world who we are." In the capital, Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was electric. Chants of Traoré's name filled the air. People lit candles not in protest, but in honor, an act of unity and hope. Families prayed aloud, asking for his strength to remain unshaken as the forum continued. Some wept openly, saying they had never felt so proud to be Burkinabe. Even those who had once doubted his leadership were moved. One shopkeeper told a reporter, "When he speaks, he doesn't just speak for himself, he speaks for us all." The pride of a nation was now tied to one man's composure, and the world was watching every second. But as celebrations grew, so did questions. What would happen next? Would the forum embrace his message, or would powerful forces try to silence it before it grew too large? The next morning promised answers. By the next morning, the clash at the forum had become the world's top headline. Every major network replayed the 5 minutes of Omar's laughter, immediately followed by Traoré's steady response. The contrast was undeniable. Some outlets framed it as a lesson in leadership, praising Traoré's ability to remain calm under humiliation. Others tried to downplay it, calling it a misunderstanding. But the public wasn't buying excuses. Online, millions demanded accountability. In Burkina Faso, children marched to school chanting his name while parents told them, "Dying is stronger than anger." In America, commentators clashed on live television. Some defended Omar. Others admitted her behavior had crossed a line. But what shook observers most was the sheer speed of the story. Within hours, newspapers in Asia, Europe, and Africa called it a defining moment of the decade. As Traoré prepared for the second day of the forum, aides advised him carefully. "The world is listening now. Every word matters." He nodded quietly, already aware. This was no longer just about one insult. It had become a test of his country's voice on the world stage. During the next session, a surprising voice rose in Traoré's defense. A senior European leader, known for rarely speaking at such forums, stood and addressed the hall. "What we witnessed yesterday," he began, "was not just an insult to a man, but to the dignity of leadership itself. And what we saw in return was courage." The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in as he turned toward Traoré and offered a slight bow of respect. Others followed. A South American delegate added, "Respect must never be optional. If a young leader from Africa can show it, so should we." The hall, once divided, was shifting. Support for Traoré was becoming open and vocal. Omar, watching from her seat, clenched her jaw as her political isolation deepened. Traoré listened quietly, offering no gesture of triumph. His stillness only made the show of support more powerful. In Ouagadougou, the speeches were broadcast live. Crowds cheered as foreign leaders defended their president. For the first time in years, ordinary citizens felt their voice mattered on a global scale. The tide was no longer just turning. It was surging. That evening, after a long day of debate, Traoré returned to his hotel. Away from the flashing cameras, he allowed himself a brief moment of rest. His phone buzzed. It was a call from his mother in Burkina Faso. Her voice trembled with emotion. "My son, I saw everything. The world laughed, but you stood with honor. Do you know how proud we are?" For the first time in days, his eyes softened. "Mama," he replied gently, "I only did what you taught me, to never answer cruelty with cruelty." On the other end of the line, she began to cry softly. "You carried not just your name, but the heart of our people." Traoré sat silently, letting her words sink in. Outside, the city lights flickered, but inside that hotel room, the world felt very small, just a son speaking with his mother. Unbeknownst to him, millions across Africa were echoing her sentiment. They weren't just watching a politician anymore. They were watching a son of their soil defend their dignity on the highest stage. The weight of the moment pressed deeper. Tomorrow, the final sessions of the forum would decide everything. The last day of the forum arrived, and the atmosphere was unlike any the hall had ever seen. Delegates who once carried stiff expressions now watched Traoré with open respect. Reporters filled the press gallery, their cameras ready for every gesture. Omar sat silently at her seat, her laughter from 2 days ago now a ghost that haunted her. She avoided the cameras, her eyes lowered as whispers about her political future spread like wildfire. When it was Traoré's turn to address the closing session, he walked to the podium with the same calm stride he had carried all week. There was no arrogance, no pride in his step, only purpose. This forum, he began, was not meant to humiliate, but to unite. We cannot claim to lead our people if we forget to respect them. My voice is small, yes, but it carries the hope of millions who want to be heard. The hall was silent again, but this time not in shock. This time it was in reverence. Everyone knew they were watching history. As Traoré finished his final words, he stepped back from the microphone. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then one by one, delegates rose to their feet. Applause erupted, shaking the hall like thunder. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a standing ovation that grew louder and louder, echoing across the world through live broadcasts. Some leaders wiped their eyes. Others clapped so hard their palms turned red. Omar remained seated, her face pale, the applause surrounding her like waves crashing against a sinking boat. Her laughter from earlier was now a distant memory erased by the tidal wave of dignity that Traoré had unleashed. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the streets were alive. Children danced, elders prayed, and strangers embraced each other, shouting, "Our president has lifted us high." Traoré, standing humbly on the stage, bowed his head. He wasn't celebrating himself. He was carrying his people's pride on his shoulders. And the world could feel it. It was no longer about a clash. It was about a transformation. The forum ended, but the story did not. News outlets declared it a turning point in modern politics. Social media crowned Traoré a symbol of courage and humility. His words were translated into dozens of languages repeated in classrooms, homes, and parliaments. Back in Burkina Faso, he returned to his people, greeted not as a mere politician, but as a son who had defended their dignity before the entire world. Families wept as they spoke of him. Children said they wanted to grow up and be like him. Even in distant nations, ordinary citizens admitted they were moved to tears. For Omar, the fallout was swift. Her career now hung in question, overshadowed by the dignity she had tried to mock. But for Traoré, the week was not about victory over someone else. It was about proving that humility can silence mockery and respect can shake the world. He ended the week as he began it, calm, steady, and unshaken. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, Don't just watch, be part of it. Click subscribe, tap like, and drop your comment below. Tell us how Traoré's courage moved you. Your words matter. Let's flood this space with dignity, respect, and hope. Join this community today, and let's keep these powerful stories alive.